We talked about and I don't know if we ever wrote this out, did we? And then to get emptiness, you get So, something like that form is established by way of its own character as the jukshir. I mean, I even end up using referent again, like shenshir, but jukshir. I mean, that's what it is. That's the referent of. Now, as the referent, and then this is, well, let's just say, as the referent of the term, as the referent of the verbalizing term, quote, form. That bag is established by way of its own character as the, you can say it, make it up in different ways, as the referent of the term bag. Okay? Now, of course, it doesn't have to be English or any other language. It is just an example. And what it means is of any particular term. It's established by way of its own character as the referent. Not that it is established by way of its own character as only back, as only the referent of the term back in English. Because that people can figure out. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I had a problem once I had converted to English if it's bag, then that's all it's going to be. And that was a big hindrance to speaking any other language. Huge hindrance. And I could do all the writing and the memorizations and all that and could hardly say a word of French. It was really with Tibetan that I broke out of that. But that's a very coarse misconception compared to the misconception of this. But if the very coarse is where you're at, then I suppose it's very subtle for you. They don't say that. They do say things like correct relative to a particular trainee. This is, like true or correct relative. This system, which is considered to be lower than the final system, is correct, yangda, relative to a particular trainee. So, established by way of its own character as the fixative basis.
What's that?
A fixative, the basis of entry, the basis of engagement, you see, as the referent, as the the object, as the basis of the juk of the term, okay? So this is jukshir, which is That's very clear what it means. So what kind of genitive is it? Type? Is it a positive? No.
Clause connected to a complement?
Well, I don't know about that one. That one isn't in my book. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, anyway. The reason for assigning various names, I started this thing back when I was at the University of Wisconsin, is so that one could notice how variously the genitive and so forth are used. You can learn such things by osmosis, but if you don't have 15 or 20 years to learn it in, it's good to have a list of the possibilities that you can run through. And of course, if you are getting the point well enough and you're not confused, then you don't need to know what kind of genitive it is, right? The aim of the study of Tibetan is not to know how to classify the subdivisions of each of the cases. But we so often get screwed up by put la as a conjunction rather than as, a case ending. I mean, you can see people who don't know that, how they get screwed up in their translations, or the usage of the so-called genitive endings for a disjunctive meaning. And then, according to Sidhu, the misuse of the instrumental endings for a disjunctive. He says you shouldn't be using the instrumental endings in place of the genitive in those situations, the non-case usages of the genitive. But a lot of people do. So, we need to make up the lists of terminology in chart form, list form, in sensible ways. You've got the basis now. This is the end of the basis. This is the other type of non-existent Megyu-gunda. It's the primary Megyu-gunda in Dotekondel. Sutra unraveling the thought. It's actually Dotekondel Do. The sutra and del here is like commenting on the thought of the sets of sutras. But Sandhi Nirmochana in Sanskrit, Sandhi Nirmochana. Nirmochana has more the sense of unraveling. And Powers chose to he chose to translate Nirmochana as explaining the sutra, explaining the thought. He told me, Karen said that's what she said. What? He told me that Karen said that this is what it means. So I asked her one day, and she said, it means unravel. And of course I had looked in at least one Sanskrit dictionary before I chose the term unravel. Anyway, it doesn't make any difference. So the sutra is available, and it was extremely helpful to me to be working with John for 3 or 4 years, must have been 4 years, translating the sutra, because that way I got to see all of it, not just with a quick read, but with a very slow read, looking at every syllable, checking and making suggestions and so forth on his translation. So I got some, I had to develop a close sense of the sutra itself, Dotekondel. So why are we talking about Dotekondel?
The primary.
Oh, yes. Yes, the primary Megyu-gunda in the Dotekondel. Does the Sutra Unraveling the Thought explicitly teach Sunzin Zekate tu Tongba? Does it explicitly teach that? That's a question. It doesn't explicitly teach it in the 7th chapter. It does explicitly teach it in the 8th chapter. So Tsong-kha-pa occasionally says things like it isn't explicitly taught in Dodegondo, but one has to say that it is, and posit his thought, say it, Gomba Shaka, as referring to the 7th chapter, because that is indeed what he's been talking about. And he himself later says, well, I think he's the one who says this, or maybe it's other people who say it isn't explicitly taught, or maybe whatever. He later himself says it's clearly taught. The Sungzin Zeta de Trube Tomba is indeed taught in the 8th chapter. And you will see my vigorous attack against the view of Alex Wayman, who read what Tsong-kha-pa was saying and derived the exactly opposite meaning. So, so I cite a bunch of commentaries also that make it clear. Anyway, so I think we're done with this phase. So, then what would you like to talk about with respect to the first 170 pages? So bringing in points of discussion today.
What is the Tibetan awakening consciousness?
Yeshe.
Yeshe.
Shara. Also, Shara. Shara is a mental factor of what? Differentiating phenomena? Yul Namba Jala, right? It's a factor of discrimination or of differentiation.
Yeah,
And that's why Gunther, in his Jewel Ornament of Liberation, translated it as discriminating wisdom or something like that. And he's taking the definition and putting it together with a word in order to convey more sense. With regard to translations, sometimes said that there are 4 types. Secure,
Secure.
If I spell anything wrong, let me know. Secure. Take your. Is it owl? Tasate? Take your. Lokyu. Say it. See, don't insist on knowing the meaning. Lokyu. So it's a translation of the words, translation of the meaning, like forward translation in the same order, and Lokyor is translating in backwards order. Sikyo, Tungyo, Tegyo, Lokyo. So, as Geshe Gyaltsen set out in California after the Avalokiteshvara, well, it wasn't the 3 principles of the path discourse by His Holiness. He said the Tibetan translator was doing Sikyor and I was doing Tungyo. The Tibetan translator was doing a simultaneous translation, and so it was just, you have to take, if you're going to do that, because the verb's at the end, you have to just start talking. And then I would do Tungyo summary. And you understand take your and look your. So it looks as if Gunther's translation was both a Sikyor and a Tungyo. right? Wisdom, or if you had to choose one or the other, I guess it's a Tungyo, because he was doing the turn, the definition, mixing it into the translation. And it's, if you translate it Ngobo, for instance, as functioning thing, since Ngobo means Tunje Nuba, then functioning thing is giving a meaning translation, let's say, or both, right at the same time. Which then, of course, you get into trouble with when you talk about the definition of functioning thing is functioning. But sometimes you absolutely need it, you know, you put it in brackets, or you put impermanent in brackets. Then?
Question on page 96. It's not so clear. I just didn't understand the significance of the full paragraph.
Further, although the object of non-conceptual overload idealism. Yeah, you see, these people often feel that for a system to be an idealistic system or an idealism, it has to be promoting the view that mind is the absolute reality. And you can see why. Idealism coming from idea, having a much broader meaning in the 19th century than it does now, although it's still used to mean mind-only type things. So they feel mind would have to be the ultimate truth. And what is the ultimate truth in Chittamatra? Emptiness, what of
Difference in nature.
Sungzin Zed Hadu Ture Tongwa Tang. This one. Suk Ture Da Chupe Chukshir Rangi Seniki Trube Tongba. Right? So it's, and there are some clear statements that on the path of seeing, one perceives just emptiness, that you're not perceiving mind, right? Even though the system is called mind only. That's no big deal. Interestingly enough, there are other statements that even Geluk, a couple Gelukpa scholars take to mean that you're perceiving mind, that mind is the ultimate truth, and that is what is being perceived. It's an interesting, very interesting issue, which I think I haven't written about it really in here. Jangya himself quarrels that if you're objects that if you're realizing an absence of difference of entity of subject and object, then you should be realizing the sameness of entity of subject and object, and thus realizing mind only. And Kedrup, one of Tsong-kha-pa's two main followers, says similar things. So it's very interesting to have the other slant on it. At least sometimes he says that. And then Jangya is attacked in return by other Geluk scholars. Okay, just a little. Although the object of non-conceptual wisdom is not a consciousness, but is emptiness, could add is, right? The object of non-conceptual wisdom on the path of seeing, for instance, is not a consciousness, is not, let's say, is not mind. Well, that might make it clearer. Because the previous sentence just said mind, just mind at the end. but is emptiness. This does not entail that mind only is not a final doctrine. In Geluk, delineations of the yogic practice school's view of emptiness, the very emptiness of a difference of entity between subject and object is the ultimate truth, the object of direct perception on the path of seeing, etc. So when you start to choke on this, just go, ah! Okay?
Actually, the first sentence,
Still.
although the object of non-conceptual wisdom is not a consciousness but is emptiness.
It is not mind, but is emptiness.
Right. How would someone argue that it does entail that mind only is not a final doctrine? I don't follow that. What's the opposite of
that if the object of the non-conceptual ultimate wisdom is not mind but it is emptiness, this would lead one to think that mind only is not a final doctrine. This would lead one to think that emptiness is the final doctrine, is not the ultimate, right? It is, although the object of non-conceptual ultimate wisdom on the, has there been discussion of, there has been discussion of the paths already, isn't it? On the paths of seeing and, really?
Yeah.
Comes later? No kidding. Okay, so then we can't say it then. Although the object of non-conceptual ultimate wisdom is not mind but is emptiness, this does not entail that mind only, well, this should be worded better then, rather than saying is not a final doctrine, is this is in relation to is not a basic doctrine, is not a fundamental doctrine of this school. You see, Willis is saying mind only is not the final doctrine, emptiness is. Why? Because a wisdom consciousness on the path of seeing or path of meditation realizes emptiness. It doesn't realize mind only. Now she's got some backing, even within Geluk, but just some shreds. And her sources are from within Geluk. Or we can say her sources are not from within Geluk, and I would just be pointing out that in most of Geluk scholarship, it's not contradictory that the ultimate wisdom consciousness realizes emptiness, but mind only is how things are. You can see that if mind only is how things are, then the non-conceptual ultimate wisdom consciousness should be perceiving how things are. So I've got to choose my words very carefully. Is not a validated doctrine. How about that instead of final? Is not a valid doctrine. And then I think the next sentence then explains that, hopefully. In Geluk delineations of the yogic practice school's view of emptiness, the very emptiness of a difference of entity between subject and object is the ultimate truth. Does that seem to follow from the previous sentence? Okay. According to standard presentations of the path structure in the mind-only school, the emptiness that is directly seen on the path of seeing and well, here it is. is the absence of determinate subject and object, or the absence of object being established by their own character reference of a conceptual consciousness, or the reference of terms, right? They tend to use even though there are two, I mean, these two go together, they go together. And so they choose the first one as the way of expressing those two, most often, not necessarily. Now, one difficulty here is, how are you going to translate Shenyu? We've often translated this as referent object. And we're going to move this to conceived object, which I think I have, so that the terms don't blur over. Conceived object, and you can see that would make some sense. I was using referent object just to make it all look clearer, but once I'm going to use Shenshir, Shenshir, and Shir, once I'm going to sloppily use referent for both of those words, because it says that terms don't have, you can't talk about Da Jukbe Shenshir or Da Shenbe Shenshir. You can't, because terms don't shen, they're objects. Good. Only Tokpa can shen. You follow? The word shenba is only used for Tokpa. So, because referent sloppily is a good sloppy term to mix the two, I mixed them. And I should have some other term for Jukshir, Jukshi.
I liked referent because Shemba, in the terms of the four objects, Shemba and Jukba have the same weight, except Shemba only refers to conceptual.
Yeah, I mean, they have the same weight.
Yeah.
And it can be a sloppy rendition into English that we don't have separate terms.
Right.
But it would be nice to be able to say, well, here's another word for Jukshi, rather than, Shenshi, rather than Shenshir. So let's come up with something. It may even be in here somewhere. So added in or of a term. Thus, emptiness so defined not only does not cancel out mind only, you see, which is based on a misreading, based on misunderstanding Geluk presentation. Hearing that there are these two emptinesses in mind only, and not understanding that Tsong-kha-pa seeks to put them together, but got the idea of their separation. And then, as Wayman and Schmithausen before had noticed, that in Asaṅga's Tsong-kha-pa, the Bodhisattva-bhūmi, in the Dekunanyiki-leu, the chapter on suchness, there is no mention at all of Sungzin Zetada de Trube Tongba. None whatsoever. So then, what do you say? Schmithausen takes the view that let's see strata within Asaṅga's writing, and that something like take two, the Mahāyāna-saṃgraha, the summary of the great vehicle, that in there, Schmithausen sees definite references to mind only, and you have to be blind not to see them. Willis also sees them. But what Schmithausen says is, Well, maybe Asaṅga didn't write Tsong-kha and did write theg, or the tradition put his name to Tsong-kha. Well, this is some of my expansions in between, where I think he says it's an earlier text. And I said, well, it's clear the tradition put his name to it.
Wayman says.
No, this is Schmithausen. It's clear to me, clear to everybody, that the tradition put his name to it. And I add, well, maybe he put his name to some large text that was, gathered over time. And so then you see, Schmithausen sees a split in these two types of emptinesses, with Asaṅga clearly putting forth mind only. Now, Willis takes the Tsong-kha as written by Asaṅga, as is theg. So the only way she can see these as the work of one author without his changing his mind is to superimpose the Tsong-kha view on the theg view. Because there is one history, I forget which one, that says that theg was written before Tsong-kha. The other history says that Tsong-kha was written before theg. Okay? So now, sorry, because there's one that says that, yeah, theg was written before Tsong-kha, and therefore he was well aware of his earlier writing, and we need to read the view of Tsong-kha into theg. Suppress the mind only. Don't see it as a final doctrine. See emptiness as the final doctrine. You see, she sees no compatibility between idealism and emptiness. Tsong-kha-pa, on the other hand, also notices that this difference in vocabulary in the two texts. And he reads theg into Tsong-kha. He superimposes a different one, theg on top of Tsong-kha, rather than Tsong-kha on top of theg. So Willis, I really admire what she's doing, just as Tsong-kha-pa is seeking consciously to build up a case, and he builds up his case through the other similarities in vocabulary between the two texts. So Willis carefully goes through theg and discounts this doctrine and that doctrine and this doctrine as non-final. Gunshi Namasheva, she considers non-final. Is just an expedient, something that Asaṅga taught. This Sungzin Zetade du Trube Tongba, mentioned clearly in theg, she sees as a non-final doctrine because she's superimposing this chapter on reality in the Bodhisattva grounds onto theg. I mean, she's doing what Tsong-kha-pa did, but the opposite. I don't know if she felt she was doing what Tsong-kha-pa did or not. But I really admire what she did. She didn't just pretend that the two were somehow in accordance. She went through and took out every mind-only aspect. She faced every mind-only aspect in the Mahāyāna-saṃgraha, the summary of the Great Vehicle. And I really admire her for it.
But that would make it seem like she saw that Asaṅga's work was closer to Madhyamaka than mind only. Would that be misreading?
She doesn't draw that conclusion, I think. But I wonder why she doesn't. What evidence there is in the Changsei Tekunanyikileo that indicates that it's non-Madhyamaka. It's I myself prefer, I think Schmithausen has shown the possibility of strata. There is one history that puts Tsong-kha first and theg second and later. And I mean, it's just an astounding omission in Tsong-kha, you know, this mind only not being mentioned. It's an astounding omission. I mean, it's hard to account for it, no matter how hard Tsong-kha tries. But Tsong-kha, I think, contributes a great deal in pointing out similarities in vocabulary on other issues. No question. Which Schmithausen doesn't seem to notice. But Schmithausen, by positing strata, earlier, later, or even Asaṅga didn't write Tsong-kha, you know, and just became part of his tradition. And you can see with Tsong-kha's added noticing of similarities of vocabulary, you can see the continuity between the two texts and how the tradition could bind these two into one person. So, you know, I take Schmithausen and Tsong-kha and put them together. Some people go so far as to say that Vasubandhu, in his 20 stanzas and 30 stanzas, Wayman, for instance, does not teach mind only. And this borders on, I mean, you can see the superimposition. He's carrying out the superimposition of Tsong-kha on Asaṅga's brother. And most scholars think this is just utterly ridiculous. You know, it's going too far. So if you take Tsong-kha, theg, and Nyingma and Sumjuba, one can see actually, I can't say that theg is less mind only than Nyingma and Sumjuba, but my sort of imagination of it is that it's not emphasizing it as much. Whereas the Nyingma and Sumjuba of Vasubandhu is clearly, you know, he jumps right into arguments against mind only. And that's very hard to see it elsewhere. Anyway, that's to get off on that topic. The emptiness so defined not only does not cancel out mind only, but confirms mind only, you see? Realizing the emptiness of different subject and object does confirm mind only. Give me a break.
Are they the same thing, or?
Well, I mean, some people say, as we said before, that explicitly realizing the same, oh, I'm sorry, no. The sameness of entity of subject and object, Geluk would have to say, is not even realized implicitly. They probably have to say something like, it's realized through the force of, you know, split a hair. Because the wisdom directly realizing emptiness in Geluk has to be perceiving just a non-affirming negative, just an absence. And it can't explicitly or implicitly realize something else. So then they have to make another category and say through the force of. Toni nusund tope shuki to. So you see, as I was saying, a system that splits at a certain point gets you just realizing a mega, a non-affirming negative, eventually gets back what it lost by sneaking in something else. And you have to not be really tricked by the first move in the, oh, it's just mega, they don't realize mine only, or something like that. Well, now this is a hugely important point, because in so much of Nyingma, what you are realizing is mind. Mind fused with empty, but not even fused. emptiness and mind that are so one and together that they never were separate. And so what advantage does Geluk get by emphasizing the absence of a difference of any of an object? It's the taking of the medicine of that absence to counter this sense of a difference of entity, taking that medicine strongly. But I think some people would be automatically led into some sort of appearance of a deeper mind when they realize the absence. And as in highest yoga tantra, in Geluk, even. Which is called the ultimate. And then they have to explain, well, it's not the actual ultimate, but emptiness is. So you have your cake and eat it too. So now, Nyingma also has to have the cake or whatever. Well, have the cake means have it for tomorrow. Have it for later on today. You eat it now and you have it for later on today, right? And I've wondered, where does it get its negative impact? Kalif, pure from the letter Ga, pure from the letter A, pure from the beginning. It's because you want to, in Nyingma, save the word primordial for other terms. Even pure from the letter Ga would be suitable to say, really. Pure from the first letter of the alphabet, but that's too long. Ganetapa, which is teamed with cutting through the hard things, like cutting through the crap. Right. You bring it over into our language, spoken language, our language, one of our languages, into English, let's call it. Cutting through the crap, cutting through hard stuff. You see? This blockage of the sense of inherent existence from its own side. If we talk Mahāyāna, Gada, take shirt, are put together. So I think it's in the Gada take shirt section. And there is some concern about the possibility of Gada take shirt becoming too nihilistic. And that's what they accuse Gelukpas of doing by making the object, within their own system, the Gada teacher can go that way. And you do have to cut through this hardness, and Nyingma is concerned that Geluk is a form of Chedong and annihilatory emptiness, because all you're perceiving is a mega. So because Nyingma feels that the Gelukpa emptiness is Chedong, they don't see any compatibility between the two truths, between emptiness and dependent arising in Geluk. Whereas from the Geluk point of view, and so you have to have something else that combines the two truths in Nyingma. Whereas in Geluk itself, emptiness doesn't cancel dependent arising. It cancels only inherent existence, or whatever one wants to say. It just cancels that. It doesn't cancel existence, or, from the Geluk point of view, the Nyingmas have gone too far in their object of negation. So they're accusing each other more or less of the same thing, promoting nihilism and just sort of stubbornly holding, no, it's you. And then you say, no, it's you. Rather than seeing how they combine it. Zhi in his, what's his system in China? What? Tiantai. He had a third truth, three truth theory. I don't know. I think it's good it's at the end of the class. But you have ultimate truth, conventional truths, and a third one that bound the other two together. And he probably says it's not separate from the other two, but still he wanted to come up with a third thing. In Geluk you get Gunzo Demba, Chuntam Demba, and Denyi Sungju. A union of the two truths, which is, but they say that's not a third term, you see? It's not even a third term, because they so define emptiness and conventional phenomena that they are compatible. But even they have to use a third term now and then. Okay, so for next time, please read Mind Only Buddhism in Tibet, which is our book 1, 1 to 26, and 125 to 148. These are the two corresponding parts. And I would point out to you, there's a set of detailed contents at the end of the volume that ties all of the sections together. The synopsis, the translation, and the Tibetan. That's at the back of this volume. But now another thing that helps is when you're reading through the synopsis, it tells you where the translation is. But I use brace, what are they called? Braces for the Tibetan. Parenthesis for the synopsis and brackets for the translation. But you see, in any one place, you'd only have two. You wouldn't have three. Thank you.